We come to the last of our lectures exploring the life lessons that we learn from the great books, and we reflect upon what in fact we have learned from the great books. And we start with our definition of what a great book is. And I think it is most interesting that our guide in defining a great book is a Medal of Honor winner and President of the United States, and that is to say Theodore Roosevelt. He read all the time. He could read 1 or 2 books a day, and frequently did. He read them in several different languages. And he was absolutely opposed, with his normal conviction, of a list of great books. Nothing is more foolish, he said, and I entirely agree with it, than a list of 100 great books, or the 5-foot shelf of classics. That was what was big in his day, 5-foot shelf of classics that every educated person should read. That's nonsense. You should read what appeals to you. And one day I might feel like reading Tennyson, and the next day I might feel like reading Alexander Pope. I don't like Hamlet particularly, Roosevelt said, though there are portions of it I think are all right, but I love Macbeth. And why should I be forced to read Hamlet when I don't want to? So he said, let you, each individual, pick what they think are the great books that speak to them. And know, as we have said in our class, that each book will speak to you differently at each stage of your life. Winston Churchill thought it was the greatest mistake in the world to have ordinary grade school and high school students read the Odyssey and the Iliad. All that will do is make them hate it, and they'll never go back to it. Let people come to these directly by reading books that they like. Theodore Roosevelt said, I don't particularly care for drama. It has to be about on the level of the Greek tragedies before I really like it, but that's my taste. I love good adventure stories. I love the Nibelungenlied, which we read in our class, and I love the Song of Roland. They're good, vigorous stories, he said. So you pick what books appeal to you. That is the first step in loving great books. And there is no such thing as a canon that everybody should read. Don't let other people tell you what you should read, because you're going to learn from it as an individual. Nonetheless, we have set criteria that I believe do mark a great book and a book worthy of spending your time upon. And the first is that it must have a great theme. It must be a theme that is noble in itself, that will inform your decisions. And so we've studied the Odyssey, Philoctetes by Sophocles. We did read Hamlet, which I think is a great play, and we read Macbeth, and we read Antony and Cleopatra, and we read Roosevelt himself. And his autobiography is the story of a great man who lived a great life and who made a great contribution, and it is fully worthy to be considered a great book. So a great theme. How to live your life. What moral values inform your decisions as you go through life? What is true courage? How do you succeed overcoming all the horrible, senseless pain caused by the Nazis if you're a young boy, Elie Wiesel? Those are great themes. And it should be written in noble language. It can be like the Gospel of John, written in clear, forceful, philosophical Greek prose. It can be like the magnificent lines of Seneca. It can be the wonderful poetry, lyrical in its intensity, of Aristophanes. But it should be language that elevates your soul. And so much of what we read today, not to mention what we hear on television and in the movies, is filthy gutter language. Now, there'll be some obscenity in a play by Aristophanes, as George Patton understood the use of obscenity. But it is obscenity that makes a point forcefully. It is not a constant repetition of filthy words. A filthy repetition will simply make your mind filthy. Whereas, as is said in The Tale of Two Cities by Dickens, there is nothing better than a good English damn at just the right moment. And certainly George Patton understood that, as did Roosevelt, as did George Washington. No soldier who served with him can forget crossing the Delaware in the swirling snowstorm on their way to Trenton and wandering around like a group of tourists asking, what are we going to do next? And his grabbing one by the shoulder at Washington and saying, God damn you to hell, stand by your officers. Just the right language at just the right moment. But we want noble language. And we want a theme that speaks across the ages. And every one of these books, I am quite convinced, speak to us now and will speak in centuries to come. You want one book from the 20th century that I believe will still move people 1,000 years from now? It's Elie Wiesel's Night. I believe that Schweitzer and his profound belief in his autobiography that we must have a reverence for life will be important as we go century into century into understanding how do we really preserve our environment. So books with a theme that speak across the ages, and then, to agree with Roosevelt, books that speak to you personally. At a particular moment in your life, it will be almost providential that you will reach on a bookshelf and pull off a work that says just what you need to know at that moment. As happened to me when I pulled Isaac Singer's The Penitent off a shelf, never having heard of it before, having had no desire to read it, and sat engrossed as I read it through in one sitting. Then how do we approach these books? For these great books are the very essence of humanism. And these are books that really have changed history. And we have read Machiavelli, Thomas More, and Erasmus, all of them humanist, all of them who were concerned deeply with human experience. And great books are the essence of the humanities, for their goal is to teach us how to live our lives. We know we're going to die. We may believe the soul is immortal, we may not. But what matters is how we live that life before we die. And the humanist of the age of the Renaissance, Erasmus, Thomas More, Machiavelli, they all believed in putting these books into a historical context, and that is what we have done in every occasion. What are the historical circumstances in which the author wrote that book? What were the works that he drew upon? And what was his or her own life? How did the events of the life of Erasmus or a Thomas More wearing his hair shirt and scourging himself on a Friday, how did that affect his utopia? So unless you know the history, unless you know who the author was, your attempt to read the book will be futile. There was something years ago called the New Criticism, which said just sit down with a text and read it. That's nonsense. You will miss one half of what you can take away from that book. And you must understand that it is part of a tradition. That Thomas More's Utopia is not fully comprehensible without Plato's Republic. That Seneca's masterful essays cannot be understood without knowing his mentor, the great Socrates. So there's a tradition that builds. And the great books are part of that tradition. So know the history, know the author, know the tradition. And ultimately, we read the great books because they give us principles by which we live our lives. And the most fundamental of these principles is the essence of this tradition of the humanities. And that is, starting with Socrates and going right on up through Theodore Roosevelt, that we live our life based on certain fundamental principles which are wisdom, justice, courage, and moderation. That is what Plato tells us in the Republic. That is what Socrates tells his students in his last meeting with them, his last class with them. We have spent all this time together learning that wisdom, justice, courage, and moderation are not names that people just give to ideas. They are realities. They are part of the very essence of God Himself. And they exist as ideals with God. And we see only reflections of them here on this earth. And wisdom, why, wisdom is something very lacking in our world today. We have a lot of information around us. That's what the internet is filled with, all of this information. You're overwhelmed by it. It's what you see in the news, all these terrible things coming under these little rolling scripts of horror each day. disasters, cyclones, catastrophes, murders. And then we take some of that information and we might weave it into knowledge. That's what you do if you wrote a good essay based on this class. But ultimately, wisdom is using this information and knowledge to live your life and to make great decisions that you have to make in life. And wisdom only comes about with solitude. The Thomas More living for 4 years among the monks. Jesus going into the desert. That is where wisdom comes, and that is what our world most wants to deny us, is solitude. We're so wired up, connected to everything, that we never have a moment to ponder. Don't read these great books unless you're going to walk and think about them. Take one in your hand, something you can't really do with that computer, and hold and reflect upon it. And wisdom only comes with solitude. And as our tragedies taught us, perhaps with suffering. Only out of suffering do we learn wisdom. Justice. Justice is how you deal with other people. And we have found one theme running all the way from the Gospel of John right on up until Theodore Roosevelt or George Patton. You do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's fairness. It's the square deal that Theodore Roosevelt talked about. And it's what Thomas More talked about. He called government an organized conspiracy to plunder the rich, an organized conspiracy to plunder the poor, an organized conspiracy by the rich to plunder the poor. And the very essence of Christianity, More and Erasmus said, as does Theodore Roosevelt, as did Lincoln, is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Lincoln asked Senator Douglas at the height of their debates, "Senator, are you a Christian?" "Yes." "What's the golden rule?" "Why, do unto others as you would have them do unto you." "Would you be a slave?" And that is the answer that echoes all the way down. So justice. And then courage. You know what courage is? Courage is being fair to yourself. It's knowing what is right and standing up for it and leaving the world a better place because you stayed to your principles. And moderation. Much of our reading has been about moderation. Making the right decision. Prudence. Socrates knew it was the right moment for him to die. Albert Schweitzer knew it was not immoderate for him to go back to medical school and to go out to Africa. That was what his destiny was. And Lewis, Meriwether Lewis, knew that when Jefferson offered him this great opportunity, there might be many who would say, "How foolish to go off into the unknown when you're right now private secretary to the President of the United States. Who knows what great things will be offered to you if you stay in this staff position?" But he chose that great destiny. So when you're right and you're exercising that wisdom, you know it's not immoderate. So wisdom, justice, courage, and moderation. Follow them as you go through life. We study the great books in this humanistic tradition, in the tradition of our founders as well, in the tradition of Joseph Addison's Cato, because they make us better as individuals and they make us better as citizens, and particularly as citizens of a free republic. And we learn lessons right now today from these great books. Josephus and the story of the war of the Jewish people against Rome takes us right to the very heart of the Middle East. And I frequently ponder how many mistakes could be avoided if our leaders and our nation as a whole simply bothered to read and ponder the lessons of the Middle East, the rich tradition of the Quran, the rich tradition of Judaism, and the deep intensity that religion has always held for that part of the world. The Jewish people in the time of Rome had the easiest choice in the world, we would say today. Rome brought them Roman values, individual freedom, the life of the city, what we would call Western values. And it did it with a tolerant government that recognized their freedom to worship as Jewish people. And they cast it all away to undertake a war against the superpower of the day, because of God and their firm belief that they must be a theocracy ruled only by God. The Romans called them terrorists, but to them they were freedom fighters. And Lawrence of Arabia, that man of destiny, how immoderate it was for a lieutenant to go off into the desert of Arabia and think that he could raise up a revolt of Arabs that would change the war. And he left behind, as his legacy, much of the political situation of the Middle East today, Iraq, Jordan. And he, to the end of his days, believed that we in Europe and America would never understand the mind of the Middle East because we refuse to understand Islam itself. And politicians, I'm not sure that politics in a democracy has changed all that much since Aristophanes and the Athenian democracy. That kind of biting political satire is only possible among a truly free people. And just change some of the names from Cleon and Hyperbolus to names that might be in our news today, and you have the same scheming politicians, the same ordinary citizen willing to be hoodwinked, these same great military adventures that end up in disaster, and the politicians clamoring to have an office they don't know what to do with if they got it. R. Thomas More said it from the point of view of a monarchy. You have all these kings, let's say of France, who want to also be king of Venice. They can't even rule France well. They got all these internal problems in France, this economic transformation, but they want to go off and rule a people that doesn't want them at all. So it does make you better as a citizen, at least to say, these are mistakes. We know they're mistakes. Let's step back before they become tragedies. But as an individual, can you learn from these great books? And one of the wisest lessons I learned from the great books is to see myself with the eyes of others. That's why Greek tragedies, like the Philoctetes, are always set in the distant mythological past, the age of the Trojan War. You see that these issues are enduring. They've been in all times and in all places. And the role of the chorus is to tell an Oedipus. It's to tell an Agamemnon. It's to tell an Ajax. This is a big mistake that you're making. You can't see it because you're so blinded. You suffer from ete, from moral blindness, and you're swollen in your hubris and your outrageous arrogance. You cannot see what a mistake this is, but I can. In Praise of Folly, it's become one of my favorite books, as Erasmus is one of my favorite individuals. Now, he was a man of great moral principle. He believed deeply in wisdom, and he acquired wisdom. He believed that the life of Christ was a pattern, and if you had the life of Christ, you didn't need all the dogma of Christianity. Justice. He tried to deal with everyone on a just and even level, though he had a furious temper that sometimes came out when his books were attacked. He had courage, but he also had moderation. He refused to join the side of the Reformation. He believed in the Holy Church. He believed in the authority of the Pope. And in his very moderation, he set a model for us of religious tolerance. But his Praise of Folly is just that, stepping back and looking at the world and all the follies that we engage in. Now, we could give them different names today. He talks about the folly of lawyers and how treacherous they are, but I happen to believe that the law and the medicine are the two noblest professions you can follow. But what would Erasmus do if he came back today and said, "Why are you running around with that BlackBerry? Do you really need to be that connected? Or is that not the ultimate folly to think that one more email is going to change anything in the world? Or in fact, that computer on which you can write book after book after book and send them off to hundreds of people." Now, when Thomas More wrote his Utopia, he had one copy. He had written it by hand. And it had to go by a trusted messenger to Erasmus to see to its publication. Not today. You can send out all of these copies, and every friend, every time you get an email, you can send it to them as well. Are we really any wiser? Absolutely not. We have a lot more information, perhaps, but we are not any wiser, and in fact, our political decisions suggest we haven't learned a single thing. So all our connectiveness. I like to think that exercising is one of our follies. I continue to wait every day for medical science to reveal that the worst thing a person of my age can do is exercise. And just as way Thomas More scourged his body, and Erasmus said that was a bad idea, but Thomas More beating his back with whips, is that any different from dreading to go into some gymnasium, working out with these weights and all of this agony, walking around and around some track like some gigantic hamster? So the folly that we torture ourselves in this life, perhaps to gain another year or two of life, are the very folly Erasmus would say when he attacked the university of our whole idea that education is nothing but credentials. I always point out to my students, the only exam the professor never has an opportunity to talk about with students is the final exam, which ought to be the most important to go over with them. But instead, you've got that credential, you're out. And so our universities that rest upon credentials and fundraising. What would Erasmus do with the development officers of today, where every aspect of our life, whether it's running for president, or whether it's making a great university, or even running a church, is measured on how much money you bring in? So our follies, Erasmus should be here to point them out to us. So to see yourself as others see you. And then we learn from the great books how to make our life choices. And it is most interesting to me how easy it is for us at various stages in our life to follow the path of Thomas More. Now, here was a man deeply learned in the great books, and step by step he took a path that he should have known, and his friend Erasmus told him was disastrous. But it was the next step up the ladder, and he had started out on that career of political favor. And so from being an undersheriff to being Speaker of Parliament to being in charge of the Duchy of Lancaster, right on up to being Lord High Chancellor of England, knowing from the fall of Thomas Wolsey that the task that the king had set him was impossible, to get the Pope to give an annulment to the marriage with Catherine of Aragon. The Pope at the very moment was the prisoner of Emperor Charles, who was the nephew of Queen Catherine. He was not going to give an annulment, but More took it. And how many times will you or others that you know be called in by the CEO, made a vice president, given some task that you know is impossible, but you go ahead and do it, and you fail disastrously? So how then do you deal with adversity when it comes to you? Well, I hope you'll deal with it the way that Thomas More did. Because here was a man who had made a very big mistake. And then, at the last, he decided he would stand up with courage. And he went to that Tower of London, and his wife told him again and again, "You are crazy to rob us of a husband and a father when almost every other churchman in England has signed this concession that the king is the head of the church. What difference will it make?" But to More, this was his destiny, and he had finally discovered it. And so he died. And ultimately, to find your destiny. We began our lectures with Seneca. Here was a man just like Thomas More who had been beguiled by power, who thought he could change an evil ruler like Nero, and found himself caught up in, even abetting, the tyrannical schemes of a Nero. But in the end, he had come to realize that his destiny was to die absolutely true to his principle. Now, how many various office holders existed under Roman rulers? We remember Seneca because he died for his principles. And how many Lord High Chancellors of England can you name? But we remember Thomas More because he found his destiny. And ultimately, that's what great books can do if you open your heart to them. To find the one thing in life you were meant to do. And you know, most interestingly, no matter how old you are, you may not have achieved that destiny. Don't let anyone ever tell you you've done what you need to do in this world. Sit back and build a house in Florida or in the Rocky Mountains. Cicero had every opportunity just to enjoy his last years. Why, he even had important tasks like getting his son back on track. And he had written the most enduring, charming essay on all the merits of a quiet old age. Not worried anymore by romantic attachments, not worried anymore about having an extra glass of wine at lunch, not worried about keeping yourself in shape, and absolutely not worried about the political situation. And had he not fulfilled everything that destiny might offer him, to have become the greatest thinker in the Latin language, to transform the Latin language into a vehicle suitable of transmitting the next 1,000 years of European civilization, to make Plato and Aristotle understood by his fellow countrymen. And yet, at the old age of 63, he stepped forward and took up the challenge and would lay his life down for the freedom of his country. Finding your destiny, whether it's that of a Meriwether Lewis, to open up whole new worlds, or of an Elie Wiesel, young boy, 14 years of age, sees his whole world collapse around him. His mother and sister taken off out of the same line that he stood in at Auschwitz, never to see them again. To see his own father die before his eyes, unable to help him. To give up his belief in God and the whole tradition in which he's been raised. And then to come to believe that there was a reason for all of this suffering. That too the great books teach us. We may never understand why this adversity comes upon us. We may, like an Oedipus, try to justify what we did. I didn't know I was marrying my mother. I didn't know I had killed my father. I can't possibly have sinned. But Elie Wiesel said, this has happened to me. I will not let it destroy me. And so out of that misery, he would not only create a soul-stirring novel, but he would spend his life trying to bring peace to the Middle East, to reconcile Jew and Arab, and to dedicate his life to this purpose. In the same way, a Roosevelt, in the same way, a Lincoln, in the same way, a George Patton or George Washington, not only found their destiny, but they also show us, as I believe a final lesson of the great books is, that our own country is unique. That the Americans have been called to a destiny. We may fight against it. We may slip back time and time again. But as Theodore Roosevelt said, there has never been a nation of people so kind, so magnanimous, so willing to forgive, and so willing to take up the challenge of bringing freedom to the world. And perhaps ultimately that's what the lesson of the great books is about, freedom. Your individual freedom to make decisions, your individual freedom to suffer, and your individual freedom ultimately to gain wisdom. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, the pursuit of happiness is all about your living your life in such a way that when you die, the world is a better place for what you did, for those you touched. And the great books are an inspiration and a guide to how you live your life so that the world will be a better place.